obviously this building that we're in right now. So Hobart was first founded in 1803. The original settlement was up the river at Wisdom Cove. It was essentially intended to deny this whole area to the French. This is obviously sort of around the Napoleonic Wars. The British and the French were sort of vying for colonial possessions. The British established a garrison up the river just to make sure the French couldn't. Within the year, that turned out to be less than an ideal spot for a garrison. There was no running water, it was mostly swamped at that point. So they moved everything down in 1804 and began Hobart Town where it is today. So we were pretty much instantly designated as a convict settlement. We had about 70,000 plus convicts come through here throughout the convict period. That's only a couple of thousand less than New South Wales, so obviously we're quite a bit smaller than New South Wales. At times convicts were more than half the population. It was fairly lawless early on, especially because for the first couple of years convicts were just assigned to a free settler and essentially let go into the world. There was no formal system of keeping them under lock and key. The free settler was basically required to look after them entirely. Obviously, if a free settler had multiple convicts, that was a bit of a tall order for one person or a small family. So fairly often convicts would run off into the bush, either become bush rangers or just get themselves killed in the Tasmanian wilderness. So that was a fairly big problem with the early colony. By 1815, they pretty much figured out that just letting the free settlers manage their own convicts was not going to be a goer. So they established a barracks and a garrison on Bathurst Street. That overflowed almost immediately, simply due to the volume of convicts. So in 1821, they constructed Old Hobart Jail, which would have originally stretched in that direction, not to the first set of streetlights, but to the second set of streetlights. So about 2 sort of modern city blocks within the rough size. It was our only jail until the 1960s, so a fairly memorable period of operation. And it was the first port of call for all male convicts entering the state. If you were a woman, you got off the ship and went to the female factory. If you were a man, you got off the ship and came here. And then you were sent to a free settler, or you were put in a work gang, or if you were a miscreant, you were sent to Port Arthur or Sarah Island to sort of do some punishing. This building that we're standing in now is the only remaining part of the jail. It's slightly later than the original jail. It was constructed in 1830, with construction finishing in 1833, and it's the brainchild of Governor George Arthur, who was a big believer in the Reformation through religion. So if you want to come around and look at the cross-section of the model. So George Arthur essentially believed that convicts were sent to church, they'd come out the other end of their sentences as reformed members of society, and obviously were keeping docile while they were serving their sentences. He originally put that plan into action by sending sedated individuals into the town, where they needed the free settlers. That was quite a complaint among the free settlers. The convicts were coming off 8-hour workdays without a chance to bathe, so they smelled fairly horrible. It was the first time one of the male convicts had seen women in quite a while, so there was a lot of catcalling and probably their general behaviour. After about 10 years of that, the free settlers had pretty much had enough of it, and this building was constructed as a convict church. So if you look at the cross-section, that door in the cross-section is roughly where the average juvenile UK convict sign is now. If you imagine pews tearing down over our head into the open middle of the building, and there'd be the other wings sliding out in that direction and that direction. And we would be standing in the feature that made this church fairly unique and possibly the entire world, and that is the solitary confinement cells that were underneath the pews. This was constructed as an extension of the jail. They needed more room for punishment cells, which you can see in the model as those little spaces there. So obviously they just stuck them in underneath. That meant that this building was never consecrated. They couldn't find a priest who was willing to do it, because while they gave services, you could actually hear people sort of yelling and moaning in the jail cells underneath. You have to imagine it sort of changed the atmosphere of the service a little bit. It was obviously rung on Sundays for church. It was also rung every hour, just to tell people the time. Most people didn't have watches or clocks back. This is the Supreme Court, unlike the Magistrates Court through there, in front of the box, so that the judge can get sort of an idea of a prisoner's body language, if they were shuffling or guilty, they were lying or guilty. It's a fairly typical courtroom. Obviously, that's the jury. Press is in there, the accused is in the box, and the judge. There also are 3 judges, given that it's a Supreme Court, that's up here, and the apples. Obviously, this was built with the acoustics of the church in mind, so it does actually work really well as a courtroom. We did have a judge die in that chair while I was being caught. He was embroiled in a scandal involving the philosophy department at the University of Sydney, funnily enough. Hobart Town, after being sentenced, we've been brought down through these tunnels, which is where we're going to go now. So if you want to follow me, and do be careful on these steps. These are the sort of one steps in the building. Use the handrail. Okay, awesome. So these tunnels were carved out in the 1850s, again with convict labour, because convicts hadn't quite finished off yet, but transportation had. Prisoners were kept down here for up to 3 or 4 hours, awaiting sentencing up above. They were bound hand and foot in chains to the wall. If you see those grooves in the floor at this end, they were bound hand and foot in chains, so you have to imagine them almost in a fetal position, and then rub their feet back and forwards to increase circulation, obviously to keep themselves warm, and those grooves are roughly where their feet would have been. So if you sort of imagine how many convicts would have had to spend time down here and how long, that's sort of an effect on a stone floor. It's fairly incredible, really. Sometimes there would have been multiple people, and you'd sort of watch the person in front of you go up, get their sentencing, and wait your turn. It would have been a fairly nasty place to spend any time.
And cold.
Yeah, and cold. It would have been gas lighting up here, fed through this pipe. So again, fairly smelly and horrible if you've ever been in a room with gas lighting. These are all quarried from the local area. If they had less sort of paint on them, you could actually pick out broadhead convict arrows and the convict fingerprints that they put in to mark how many blocks they'd done. There's some much more obvious examples of that if you ever get a chance to walk around the exterior of this building. You can see some of the bricks with thumbprints and fingerprints pressed into them. The convicts essentially, they'd put their fingers in a brick to mark how many bricks they'd done. Maybe they'd do every 100 bricks or so, you put your mark in. Obviously lots of fights would break out because people would put their marks in other people's brickwork. Yeah, it was a fairly sort of lawless environment. And if you come through this way, which way? So this is possibly a stone put in to mark the building, or possibly a reused waystone that was brought from up above. And probably even it might be a gravestone, in fact. Yeah, it's sort of hard to read, in fact. Yeah. Certainly a lot of the bricks in here were reused from other constructions, and when we go through to the chapel, we'll sort of get an idea of lots of the structures up above us were reused from the chapel. So the judge's stand is made of wood, made from the pews. They essentially reused everything when they converted this whole area into a court. And the court did operate up until 1983, I think was the last court held here. So yeah, there are actually some barristers and judges who can remember doing proper courts in this building, which is fairly incredible. Wow. Yeah, so it is sort of a long period of operation. Yeah. So just through here, we can't go down this work properly, sadly, because the magistrates' court's having lots of problems with the roofing. It was done in the 60s and, funnily enough, is lasting much worse than the convict made stuff, so lots of tiles are falling in. But this passage goes through to an identical box in the magistrates' court, just the exact mirror of the setup that we went through there. Except obviously with a closed box, because they didn't judge it quite as important to sort of see the prisoner's body language while they were working.
What's all that music coming from?
That's their film.
Oh.
So they're just finishing off the film.
Oh, right, okay, I'm with you.
Yeah, and they're pretty wonderful doors.
Incredible.
So if you want to just come up through here, just step on these stairs again. This great window, which is obviously pretty out of place where it is today. If you imagine it on the back wall of a great big chapel, makes a lot more sense. Prisoners would have entered through this door, and a door that no longer exists because they've put this wall through it. Behind this wall would have been the prison. The prison, like I said, lasted until the 1960s. It was Hobart's only jail until Risdon opened. So pretty much all prisoners in the state would have spent a little bit of time here. There was a great sort of treadmill, which is you can sort of get an idea of it from this, but it's essentially a giant sort of elongated treadmill, and prisoners would get in separate booths and just spend a couple of hours just sort of treading on it, just to sort of give them something to do and possibly grind a bit of bread. Often there would have been big sheets put up so that the convicts and the free settlers in this wing couldn't see each other. They could still smell each other and hear each other though, so they did have smell problems involving that. The graffiti on the walls, the things that we'll know for a fact are original. This piece here, because the prisoners put his prisoner number down, so we can actually sort of say, okay, this is a prisoner who was there. And there's a little sketch of Elvis that was made a prisoner in the 1950s, just there. Other than that, a lot of it probably is real and we just can't verify it because they've been kind of the holding cells in the yard. There are quite a few convicts who have spent some time doing fairly impressive, anatomically correct pictures of naked people. Plus some sort of unkind words about police officers. More stories of those holding cells. All three wings obviously would have looked like this originally. So you can sort of imagine three wings this way and this way. They see each other. They could definitely still smell each other, however. These vents in the ceiling were put in to address the smell problem. They never really figured out they should just make the convicts bathe.